Good morning. I remember probably one of the first couple of times we were here when we were coming up to visit every few weeks, about 12, 14 years ago, something like that. And Gordon Miller was teaching Sabbath school that week and talking about the need to have a testimony. And everybody needs to have a testimony. And we just heard a testimony in that children's story. And I know a lot of people, when they come to know the Lord, they take a stand for Him, they get baptized, all of a sudden they just don't know what to say. And that's how I was at the time, you know. And Gordon Miller's talking about the value of a testimony, and I just said 2 or 3 sentences, you know. I didn't think it was worth very much. And he says, oh, well, you know, that was a pretty good testimony. Short, you know, but... and I just reading recently how several times in the book of Acts, Paul also had repeated his testimony. You know, I think it's very important for us. So I thought today I'd share my testimony with you. I was first introduced to the idea that man is flawed and in need of the Savior when I was 10 years old at Camp Chestermere, which is a Baptist Bible camp near Calgary here. And I remember one afternoon I was walking around thinking about what the camp counselors and the teachers had said to me about needing to accept Christ into my heart. And I decided, yes, that's what I wanted to do. So I went over to the pastor's trailer. They called him Sky Pilot. I knocked on his door, and he led me in a prayer to accept Jesus into my heart. Now, no one from this camp followed up with me in any way. I continued to go back. I was being raised in the United Church, and they had given me a very nominal understanding of the Bible, a very good base to build on, which I'm glad for. But the born-again perspective was not there. And I do value that base. In fact, one of the nicest things they did for me was at 15, they gave me a Good News Bible, and I decided I was going to read it, wanted to know what it said, so took a page a night just before bed every night and read. It took me between 6 and 7 years until I was finished. Having accepted the Lord, I did have a basic desire to be good, not having the knowledge that I could only do that in His strength. Of course, I was weighed down by the world. Over the course of my years growing up, I gave in. I tried the ways of the world as well. One illustration I'll give. At 16, I made the mistake a lot of other people made. I tried marijuana. Now here I was, damaging my brain, right? Destroying my health. Here I was lying to my mother when I came home to fake that I wasn't high when I was. And I was opening the door to Satan worship with these heavy metal rock and roll people that I was hanging out with, right? I felt no guilt about any of those things. The only thing I felt guilty about that day was that I'd done all this on a Sunday. As if somehow it would have been not as bad if I'd done it on a Monday or a Tuesday. You see the self-righteousness there? My Christianity consisted of the fact that I went to church. And then because I did that one thing for that 1 hour on that one day, I got to do whatever else I wanted for the rest of the week, right? Now, I'm not trying to glorify my sins. I'm just trying to make that point. My lowest time was just after I'd moved out on my own. I was living in Cranbrook and Fernie, BC when I was 20, trying the wild party lifestyle, but the Lord was still working in my life. 2 distinct experiences stand out. One, I decided after about a year living out there, I was going to go back to church, and went to the United Church, got a ride from a family, very nice family. And they had the most beautiful, peaceful music in their car. And just being in their presence, I felt totally and completely defiled, completely dirty inside. And they were obviously on fire for God. And yes, you know, I don't want to sound like I'm trashing the United Church. There are people who are on fire for God here in the United Church. And their peacefulness really, really spoke to me at the time, but I wasn't ready. The other experience actually happened a couple of months earlier. The very first job I got when I moved away from home was at the radio station in Cranbrook, and I was brought into contact with a Pentecostal man there named Scott, and he was talking to me about the need to be born again, about accepting Christ. So I went with him to a full gospel businessman's fellowship dinner, stood up at the altar call, and by this time I was almost finished my reading of the Bible. So I wanted to be clean again, I wanted to have Jesus in my life, but some of the things in our conversation and in the pamphlets he gave me afterwards, some of the follow-up materials, just didn't make sense. There were some artwork and illustrations making some of the points in this one particular little booklet that he gave me. A lot of it I agreed with. They were talking on one page about how Life is like a battlefield, and there's a little picture of you in the tank, and then God's on one side, Satan's on the other, and you've got the choice in the middle. Which one you're going to let influence you, right? Another page had all the lists of the arguments of New Age thinking, of agnosticism and atheism, and all the Bible verses that countered it, the real truth. And then another page, picture of a dragon and all these little thought bubbles, like a comic about all these things that come out of the mouth of the dragon, like hedonism, materialism, alcoholism, the ways of the world, you know? I agreed with all that. Fine. But then I turned the page, and there's an illustration of 1 Peter 3:18 and 19. It's a very hard to understand reference. We're not going to look up any Bible verses today because I've got a lot to say, so just to save time. But it's the one where Jesus was preached to the spirits in prison. And here's this picture of Satan guarding the door of hell, and Jesus is knocking on the door of hell. And he's saying, I've come for those captives, Satan. And all of a sudden, this light went off within me. And I thought to myself, you know, I'd already been told, and well enough, from the Baptists and the Pentecostals and the United Church, and all the times I'd grown up, everything I'd ever heard about Christian thought was hell was the place of final judgment. The people were sent there already by Jesus, and they had no hope. It was already, hope was cut off for them. So why would Jesus go down there to rescue the ones that he sent there in the first place? It made no sense. And the other thing, of course, was the whole speaking in tongues thing. 20 years old, I'd never seen this before. I was open to the idea that maybe it was of God because I'd read the miracle stories in the book of Acts. I'd read the miracle stories of Jesus. This was a supernatural thing happening, the way he was moving when he was doing his thing. You know, his feet were not holding him up. Something else was holding him up because he was going much further back than a human being could. You know, so something was happening that was supernatural. But now I know that Pentecostalism is the false fire that Revelation 13 talks about that comes down from heaven. And that's what Ellen White was talking about in the Great Controversy when she said Satan would seek to introduce a counterfeit to the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. That's what it is. And I've got a lot of peace now because of that. And I'm very glad that when in their church they went to lay their hands on me, nothing happened. Very, very glad. Between these two experiences as well, I did take the confirmation class from the United Church. As you know, they baptize babies, and just like the Catholic Church, then you're confirmed. You get a chance to make your own decision afterwards. Again, lots of good spiritual things, but without that born-again perspective, and that makes so much of a difference. It was when I met Melissa, though, that I saw really practical Christian love in action. And I remember when I was courting her, just realizing it as the words were coming out of my mouth, saying, God wants us to be together. And it was her example that was very helpful to me in many ways. One time, we were out for dinner at a buffet restaurant, and she says, how's your roast beef? And she's a vegetarian, and I wasn't. And I said, it was okay. And she said, well, good. You know, and her love for me was greater than this difference between us. That spoke to my heart. Another time we were watching that 6-hour mini-series about Jesus. You may have seen it. Well, I can't remember the guy's name, the actor who played Jesus, but here's Melissa crying during the scenes when Christ is on the cross. And I had never thought about it in that sense that it was that real for me, you know. And then, of course, another time, I could name more examples, but another one was she loaned me her copy of Ellen White, Prophet of Destiny. And I actually believed Ellen White was a true prophet, probably a good 6 months before it became an Adventist after reading that book. Now, when I finished my reading of the Bible, together with her, we did a reading of those Uncle Arthur, those red children's storybooks. And that basically got the whole Bible over again right away, the whole theme, the whole storyline. And then after that, our marriage preparation class somehow turned into a Bible study for me, which was also a wonderful thing. And it was there that I learned again that through Christ I could be clean. And you can't have any real peace of mind even in this life, let alone the hope for heaven without Jesus, you know. And something else was different too, because every week as I was considering what I was being shown, not only was I falling more and more in love with the Lord, but I was being shown a complete circle of truth, where every individual truth
related so well to every other truth, it formed an impregnable circle of truth that I couldn't poke any holes in like I was able to with what I was being shown 3 years earlier from the Pentecostals. And it all related back to the cross, and that makes it so important. It's born-again Christianity that makes the difference, that adds the power to the doctrine. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of rules. Now, for a lot of people, this is where their testimony might end. For evangelical Christians, you read what they have to say, that's where it ends, right? I was a sinner, now I'm saved. A lot of times the stories are very moving, they're very wonderful, they're very important, it's good, that's great. But we're different as Adventists because we don't see doctrine as something separate from the salvation experience. So by mercy and truth, you want to call that Bible verse back up? By mercy and truth, atonement is made for iniquity. He gives you mercy when, if you were a cocaine snorting prostitute for 20 years and all of a sudden you're in your right mind again and you're able to clean your act up. He gives you mercy when he forgives you for all kinds of things you've done. But he also gives you truth when he shows you the better way. He says, walk ye in it. And so here's the better way that I've shown you. A number of things. Here's where my testimony continues. And again, I will repeat, I am thankful for everything the Lord has done for me, including where he led me through in the United Church and with the Pentecostals and Baptists that I did associate with and what I learned from them. It's not to trash them. But I was learning a deeper point of view here, studying with an Adventist wife and an Adventist pastor. I used my Good News Bible. She used her NIV, and he used King James. So that also gave us a good, well-rounded study. And even on the basic things, we looked first at the Trinity, and we looked at creation and the atonement, and how Jesus' death on the cross was not just for any one individual person, but for the whole world at the same time, and for all of human history. It's being shown a plan of salvation that encompasses
more than just Christ died for me. When you hear those words, a lot of people interpret them from the sense of man's point of view. But what I was being shown was the history of the world from God's point of view and what God had done for the world in giving Jesus to us. And even the understanding of forgiveness was a much deeper understanding. What I had from my childhood was basically everything is written down on a piece of paper up in heaven. Every good deed you did over here, every bad thing you did over here. And you ask for forgiveness, he takes a rubber stamp, forgiven on it. But that's not what it is. It's a complete wiping out. Like you clicked and dragged and highlighted it with your mouse and hit delete, and it's gone. You got a blank page. A complete restoration to innocence. That's what I cried over, because that's the promise that was given to me. And that's what made everything else so much more worthwhile. And I'll talk about some of the other things, doctrinal issues that I learned. And the point today is not really to prove what I learned is true. Most of you already agree anyways. But it's really to show you how what I believed enhanced my walk with the Lord. To show you that doctrine is definitely a part of the salvation experience. So I've got 7 points here. Point 1. When I grew up, I was basically taught, everywhere I was taught was God. Whenever they said the Old Testament, this story, that story, it was always God did this for Israel. God did this for Joseph. God did this for whoever. Right? And so I was left to think of that as the Father. And then all of a sudden, the New Testament, Jesus does this, Jesus does this, Jesus does this. So you take that train of thought to its logical conclusion. Unless you end up getting it corrected, you can only think of Jesus as a deified man, because you can't find him in the Old Testament. But one of the most important things, Garrett, just a second. That was one of the most important things I learned, was it was God the Son. He's the front man for the Trinity through the whole Old Testament. According to Isaiah 59, 1 and 2, we're cut off from the Father by sin. So it was Jesus who appeared to Adam and Eve and talked to them that day. It was Jesus who appeared to Hagar and to Abraham and Sarah and Moses and Joshua and Samson's parents. And one of the ways this was confirmed was actually in this Bible that Melissa gave me as a souvenir, commemorative gift once I got baptized. New King James Bible, you look through the New King James in the Old Testament, every time you see angel of the Lord with a capital A, that's Christ. You know? So I think that's very, very important. It affects how you understand your theology. That's why Jesus is the lamb, slain from the foundation of the world, because he was with the Father and did all those things. And the plan was started right there, and the plan was being worked step by step right from there on. Point 2, before we studied out the Sabbath, the pastor gave me 3 other studies. One was on the 10 Commandments, the other was on the ceremonial laws, and the third was on the difference between the two. And this is where we covered Colossians 2:14-16, talked about the difference between the Sabbath days, what it says there, the ceremonial Sabbaths, in the institution of the 4th commandment. And as for the Sabbath itself, he showed me the Bible references from creation, through Old Testament times, into the church in the New Testament, and on into the new earth in Isaiah 66, 22 and 23. And then we had a study looking at Sunday. And we covered, I think there's 8 references to Sunday. I think we covered 6 of them, 7 of them. But we noticed how not one of them showed any real significance to the day. It's just a mention. It just happens to be that day that such and such happened. You know, the 5 on the resurrection, and then we looked at the one in Acts where the man fell out the window, and the pastor showed me how it was a Saturday night, you know, and then a little bit more on that. All this was after we had studied confession, forgiveness, justification, and sanctification. And so by now, I was falling in love with the Lord and wanting to go back to church to express that. And Melissa was very nice when she said, we can't keep 2 different days or we'll get nothing done. You know, so I decided to give her church a try. And I don't know exactly when that happened, but by this time we were regularly attending. I trusted her, I trusted her pastor, I trusted the Bible studies I was being given, so I decided to try it out. And when I compare the way I was at 16 to the way I was there at 23 and in the last 20 years, I've come to a new understanding on what worship is all about. Right? False worship is always centered, whether it's got a Christian label on it or not, it's always centered in man's ability to bring himself to God. Right? But true worship, and true worship can only be Christian, it is on God's revelation of himself to man. We come here, we fall before him, we're broken, we're made anew, we go back refreshed. That's what it's all about. And God's there in a special way during this worship experience. Now, in those early days also, it was helpful to me to see that the worship style of the Adventist church was a lot like the United Church, having grown up that way. We're a very intellectual faith. We're not an emotional faith. And from my experience with the Pentecostals, I've always been put off by what's called contemporary Christian worship nowadays. You know, you can swap out the organ for a set of drums. You can swap out the piano for an electric guitar. That doesn't guarantee you're going to bring God any closer, now does it? Right? But you see, you look at the first angel's message. It's calling for revival in worship. There's all kinds of people who have realized in the last 100 years that the old-fashioned worship styles just don't seem to work anymore. But they don't know why, right? It's because God's not there in that special way on a normal day of the week. You can only get a special experience with God on a special day of the week, right? So you compare that kind of thinking to what Revelation 14 is really trying to say. It's like 2 school buses that are stuck in the mud. And one says, okay, we'll get some sand and we'll get better grip and we'll spin the tires better and we'll get out of the mud. And the other says, I know, we'll paint the school bus jazzy blue colors and then so many people will love this custom van school bus that they'll jump on and the weight of them will give the tires the grip they need. And it doesn't, it just gets them more stuck in the mud. That's all it is. Now this concept of the specialness of the Sabbath, once I truly experienced it, after I got baptized, the 4th time I kept the Sabbath in faith like this, I totally rejected evolution. I had a friend share a pamphlet with me once when I was in grade 8. I had been raised thinking, you know, reading Reader's Digest books, thinking about evolution and the earth is 4 billion years old and all that. And this pamphlet did plant doubt in my heart, but I wasn't able enough to bring myself to reconcile. So I just thought Adam was maybe the first caveman who gained intelligence or something, you know, and that the rest was myth. But I realized, having just been brought through all this, having come to know the Lord, that his salvation wouldn't mean anything if he hadn't already made me in the first place, right? So of course Adam and Eve is true. Of course Noah's Ark is true. Of course Abraham is true. It all happened exactly the way the Bible said. Spiritual proof. Not science, but spiritual proof is all that I needed. Now, point 3. Early on in our study time, we had some brief discussions on the nature of death. I was sort of forewarned that it was going to come up, that death is like a sleep, the first death. And at the time, the pastor just said to me, you know, it does make a difference what you believe. But I didn't care. It didn't matter to me at all. But later on, we finally got to the subject, and I saw some references from the Bible that used the word sleep as a metaphor for death, and it started to make sense. In fact, I remember that day going through that study, and I said to myself in my mind, I said, pretend you're a sociologist or an anthropologist. Set yourself apart from the two belief systems for just a moment and analyze them. Which one is the most realistic? And when you think about it, for everybody else, heaven is some sort of ghosty, wispy fairyland, right? Or people will say, oh, heaven's in another dimension. Well, that's just a pseudo-scientific way of saying the same thing, right? But this understanding of death helps you to understand that heaven and the angels and everybody out there is in the same physical reality as you and I are in. If you could get in a space shuttle today, you could fly there. If God was willing to let you, you could fly there and stand and shake Jesus' hand right now. You don't have to be a ghost to do it, right? Now, more practical ramifications of this, of course. That's why contacting the dead is so completely banned in Scripture, because it's all of the devil. And you know that. Even something that seems Christian, like an appearance of Mary or Mormon theology, it's all evil angels in disguise. Nothing more, nothing less. And this also answered a really serious question that came in my mind as I was reading my Bible page by page over the 6-year period. Once I got into the New Testament, hearing and seeing the words where the writers of the New Testament were writing as if they expected the second coming of Christ in their lifetimes, when obviously that didn't happen. So were they wrong? But the truth about death helps you to understand that. God calls each of us in our time to do our best to make our world a better place. And then we go to sleep, we close our eyes. From our point of view, we open them again, we see Jesus. So we get what seems to us to be an immediate fulfillment of all those things, which of course it isn't, but it is for everybody at the same time at the resurrection. So it made sense, and it answered that question and helped me to reconcile that. Now, point 4. Of course, we studied the first death. Right after that, we studied the second death. And you've all heard it before. Everlasting punishing, people teach, but everlasting punishment is what it really is. And they will cease to exist when the fire comes down and burns them up. But the two most wonderful things that happened to me as I learned this, it gave me a new appreciation for God's love, right? Hell is like a mercy killing. When you put your pet down because it's got the rabies, and you know you're ending the suffering, right? And that's what God's going to do. And I remember the words when the pastor said, two things he said was, one was, when they see the city, when it comes down from heaven and they see it, and the rich reward to the righteous, that's the real punishment, when they see what they could have had. You know, and that really stuck out in my mind. And the other one was when he said, Christ died the second death. It took me some years to really think about what that meant, but understanding the truth about the second death changes the value of the atonement, as Ellen White talks a lot about in the Desire of Ages, I believe it is. Think about it this way. Matthew 7:23, God says, depart from me, you evildoers, I never knew you, right? So how can someone depart from the all-seeing, all-knowing God unless they cease to exist, right? So there's that depth of brokenness that sin creates. And that's what happened to Jesus on the cross when he said, why have you forsaken me? Because the Father, Jesus had an unbroken connection with the Father all the time he was here. And then suddenly the Father broke that connection to that same depth that he will with the wicked on Judgment Day. And that's what it means when it says, Jesus who knew no sin became sin for us. And that's 2 Corinthians 5:21. It's a much deeper way to understand the value of the atonement than to just focus on the physical suffering. Point 5, since she was vegetarian and I wasn't, I did ask Melissa once if there was anything that she wasn't comfortable with me eating. So she told me pork, and she said it's unclean and explained to me a little bit about it from that the Bible says it's unclean. So out of the greatness of my love for her, I totally lost interest in pork that immediate moment. And a little while later, we actually did study health, the spirituality of health, and I was shown some Bible verses, mostly from the Old Testament. I don't remember any New Testament evidence, but I trusted the pastor and decided, yeah, okay, I'll make this official. And later on in my own personal study, I did find New Testament evidence as well, that the list of clean and unclean foods is still to be kept. But what's interesting is this was the thing that sent the biggest shock waves through my family. Bacon was my favorite food up until that point, you know? And I remember the last time I saw my Aunt Karen, she says, well, Les always liked his bacon. You know, once you take a stand in some practical way in your life, right? That's what all of a sudden makes people jump up and take notice, right? In that same study, we also studied how it's wrong to drink alcohol. And I don't ever remember we had liquor at our wedding, and I had a drink, you know, I drank then. And I don't remember any time in the next year after that saying, no more booze after today. But the more I fell in love with Jesus, the less interest I had in alcohol. It was just gradual. I just totally had no interest in it at all. Now, point 6. In this initial study, we never did cover the sanctuary doctrine, but the pastor mentioned it. And it took me a full 5 years to comprehend the sanctuary doctrine once I was told about it, once it was explained to me. It's actually the most difficult theological concept there is. And the reason why no other Christians can embrace it is because of their misunderstandings on the truth about death. Because they think you go to heaven or hell right away. What's the point of having all these ghosts up in heaven for 6,000, 4,000, 2,000 years, and all of a sudden having to start opening the books in 1844 and judge whether they should be there or not? Makes no sense to them. That's why they can't embrace it. So these, again, do you see the connection there? How one truth is connected to the other? And how you have to have the whole thing for it to make sense? But understanding this doctrine did help my walk with the Lord in a very practical way. I've gone through times in my life where I'm up and I'm down. I struggle with depression. And sometimes I'll be overwhelmed with guilt from some stupid thing I did, I don't know, grade 9, something like that, you know. And even after coming to know the Lord, this continued. It's now something I've struggled with. But believing that I did, that heaven was a real place, believing that there was a real sanctuary, or a real temple with a sanctuary in it. And the first time I heard about that was Baptist Bible Camp, by the way. And believing that Jesus is up there with those 100 million angels doing the paperwork right now. So there were times in the first couple of years as an Adventist, I would pray and I would say, Lord, please take such and such a sin and wipe it out in the sanctuary now. I ask that. And now I can't even remember what those were. They literally don't exist anymore. Point 7, the reason the pastor couldn't cover the sanctuary was because he was being transferred to a new district, and the study had to be cut short. But that brings up another miracle of God's grace. When I was in grade 11, 16, 17, I was working at the Woodward's department store, and for a short time there was another Christian fellow working with me. We were stock boys. He was a really nice guy. I remember him inviting me to some event at his church. The same thing as that United Church family. I felt totally convicted of sinfulness and just didn't want to deal with it at all, so I didn't go to his event. Don't even remember what it was. But then here I am, it's, I don't know, June something of 1988, and I'm working at a restaurant. There's me and this other waitress, and I invite her to an event at the Adventist church. And all of a sudden I thought about 5, 6 years earlier, wow, I'm the invitor and she's the invitee. And I realized at that moment I believed absolutely every single thing I'd been shown, and that Jesus had changed my life. Right? It was very soon after that we studied baptism. The pastor said to me, Les, it's time. I think you need to get baptized. If he hadn't asked me I may have just said, thank you very much, and just gone on my merry way once the studies were over. Right? People need to be asked. But the Lord was leading him. The Lord knew what happened that day. The pastor wasn't there. Melissa wasn't there. And the Lord knew that I was ready. And so the Lord asked me. So in conclusion, it's important for each of us to remember that time that God shone His light of love into your life. Remember all that He's done for you. And some conversion stories are not gradual or are not instantaneous. Some conversion stories are gradual. But remember all that God has done. It will help you when times get tough, when it feels like God's not there. He promised what He started in you, He will finish, right? And also, it will help others to hear your story. I put all this together for a Baptist cousin-in-law of mine living up in Edmonton. I was trying to reach out to him this spring. And if there's anybody in particular you're trying to reach out to that you've got a burden for, I want to suggest that you try this way. Don't just tell them what you believe, but tell them how what you believe has enhanced your walk with the Lord. Because learning pure doctrine is just as much a miracle of the Holy Spirit.